2016. The Amsterdam show offers an excellent opportunity.
Welcome, and thanks for attending our webinar today. My name is Lori Zarling. I'm the ISSA Director of Technology Services. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. If you are having any problems with the internet audio, we do have a phone number you can call in. We've posted that in our public chat area at the bottom of your screen. The number is 888-850-4523 with the passcode 113834. Feel free to call in at that number to get the audio session of this webinar. If you do call in, the system does automatically mute your phone. However, as we all know, there can be some issues with technology now and then. So if you could please also mute your phones just as a double check so that we don't get any background noise, we would really appreciate that. We will also be having a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. You can feel free to submit questions throughout the session whenever they come up. To submit a question, you do that through our chat area. It's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You'll see a tab that says Private. You click on the Private button, then click on Leaders and Assistants. That will open a new tab where you can type in your question and hit Enter to submit the question. We'll then gather all of those questions and again address those at the end of the presentation. So now moving on to our actual presentation. The speaker today is Steve Spencer. Steve is a facility specialist in cleaning and interior maintenance for State Farm Insurance Company. He's regarded as one of the nation's leading authorities on safety, health, hygiene, and is a nationally recognized consultant, author, and speaker with more than 30 years of experience in the jansan industry. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Steve so he can go through his presentation about water conservation.
Good morning. As you can see from my first slide, I call it water as a resource, but water conservation is fine too. But I want to give just a little heads up going into this. I'm not really what they call a tree hugger or a extreme ecology person. Basically, my daughter, when she was 6th grade, she kind of shamed me into starting to recycle, and I've been doing it ever since. And I do own a Prius, but it's because it gets good gas mileage. But I do believe that we need to do whatever we can to conserve our resources. And my job at State Farm has always been to keep abreast of what's going on in all sorts of industries within the United States and the world, because it will impact how we design our buildings, how we redesign them, if we're remodeling them, how it's going to affect our cleaning processes. So I've done a lot of 30,000 feet type look at things, and I run across things all the time, and this is one of the things I thought for our industry, this water as a resource that's going to have an effect on what we do in the future. So let's get started. The first slide is water is important, and you got the number 3 there. We have to understand that 3 is the magic number, as you've always heard on Schoolhouse Rocks. But we also know that there's 3 things that every human being needs in order to live. And those things are food, water, and air. And the number 3 is important because without those things, if you're going to die, the average person will die if they go for more than 3 weeks without food, or 3 days without water, or 3 days without air. So that's a pretty important thing to us as individuals because we have to have those things. And so I've always thought that water needs to have a little bit more emphasis on it. Today we're going to look at some key issues about water, how, where, and why, the population and how that affects water, and then infrastructure as well and some of the other things that go along. And also talk about what impact it's going to have on our industry and what I see is things that might have to happen as we go into this future. First thing is 97.5% of the world's water is salt water. only 2.5% of it is fresh water. And we're going to talk about fresh water because that's what we use. But 70% of that 2.5% is actually water in the polar ice caps, which we're not going to be able to tap, or at least we haven't to this point. And 30% of the fresh water is underground or in the soil. And less than 1%, which is why you got 100+% there, is accessible in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. So automatically we're looking at fresh water as being a minority of the water that we have on Earth. And that information is supplied to us by the World Health Organization. 80% of the global fresh water is used for agriculture. That's through the United Nations. And it is used for producing food, which is one of the other three things we have to have in order to live. So, but we need to be aware of that aspect, that a lot of our fresh water is going to agriculture. Now let's stop and define fresh water in two segments. We know salt water is salt water. If salt combines with fresh water, that's called brackish water. That's an extra that's not on your slide here. But if you've ever heard of the term brackish, that's where you get seawater and fresh water that's commingled. And if once it's that way, you can't use it as fresh water anymore. But potable water is water that is safe enough for drinking and food preparation. And so that's important for us to know, because most potable water is not available in a lot of the underdeveloped countries of the world, and a lot of areas of the United States, potable water isn't as readily acceptable as well. Non-potable water is water that's not safe enough for drinking or food preparation, obviously, but it can be used for washing cars, watering the lawn, as water for cooling towers and other things that don't require potable water. The interesting thing to point out here is, before we go any further, is that most of the time we think of this non-potable water as fresh water, which it is, but most of the water, for instance, in my house, all the water that comes into my house is potable water. Yet I use that potable water to flush my toilet, I use it to wash my car, I use it to wash my pets, I use it for a variety of other purposes, but they're not necessarily require potable water, which means that we're using potable water, which is a small percentage to start with, and we're using it in areas where we don't really need potable water. We could use non-potable water instead. But that's just not the way we are. As a matter of fact, I know a lot of agricultural areas, they have water that they bring in, and it's potable water that they're using to irrigate with and wash their cattle down, etc. And I'm not sure we should use that. This is where, in the case of non-potable water, we look at two different types of water. One is gray water, which is relatively clean water waste from sinks, showers, washing clothes, dishwashers, things of that nature. It's not it's not something you would use to prepare food or drink, but it is something you could use for those other operations, such as washing your car, watering your lawn, and things like that. We'll be talking about that more as we go into the presentation. But that's gray water. The other type of water is black water. Black water is described as wastewater that contains fecal matter, feces, urine, and flush water from flush toilets, because once you get urine and fecal matter in a toilet and it flushes, now it's contaminated with fecal matter, and it's not the type of water we can use for anything else. You don't want to use it for irrigation. You don't want to use it for anything else because of the bacteria and things that come in the fecal matter. Second thing we need to talk about is population. As we grow bigger, and right now the United States is growing at about 0.8% per year. The current population is about 323 million, as you see here. Population last year was just a little short of that, so we've grown over 2 million, 2.5 million people in 1 year. And the charts say that by 2026, by the Census Bureau, that we will hit just close to 350 million people. Well, why is that important? It's because basically the more people we have, the more usage that we're going to have. And so that's going to impact how much potable water is going to be available to individuals as we go forward for drinking and making food. The world growth population is even more staggering. It's a little over 1% per year. Current population is 7.3 billion people, and the growth from last year was 87 billion. Take that back, it's 7.3 trillion. Population in 2026 is going to be 8.2 trillion people in the world, which is just absolutely amazing. And there's a lot of countries out there, especially places like India and parts of China and Africa, that don't have freshwater sources, so it's going to impact them even more than we do. Another factor that we forget about is the United States, as most of the world is subject to drought. Drought's a big impact on our freshwater supply. And I did a little research and found out that since 1920, so basically we're almost 100 years, every decade, going back to the 1930s, we have had drought, and in some cases major. Matter of fact, 1930s we had the Dust Bowl, which is the fifth greatest impact on drought that we've ever had, and they measure that in the breadth of how big an area that it took in, the drought took in, and how much economically it impacted the United States. So the Dust Bowl was number 5. In the 40s we had drought in Southwest and New Mexico and Texas, and you're going to see that New Mexico and Texas in that area down there gets drought on a pretty regular basis. 1950s, the Great Plains and Southwest had a major drought for most of the decade, and that was listed as the number 4 worst drought that we've ever experienced. In the 60s, we had the northeastern drought. That was a whole northeastern part of the United States in the 60s for almost 7 years, I believe, and that was the number 3 as far as worst in impact. In the 70s, we had a bunch of short-term droughts all over the United States for about 5 to 7 years. In the 80s, we had the North American drought in the 80s, and that was the number 2 most devastating drought that we've experienced. In the 1990s, from 1993 to 1999, the Northeast had a drought that impacted them greatly. In 2000s, the Midwest, Southeast, and Texas, matter of fact, the end of 2000, Texas was in a drought that actually spilled over into the next decade, our current decade. And what that has been in that area, Texas was still in the drought. The West Coast was involved, southern states, and North America. That drought, especially back in 2012 and 13, that has been the number 1 worst drought with the effects and the widespread nature of it. At that point in time, 2013, there was like 60% of the United States that was in some form of drought, from abnormally dry to severe drought conditions. One of the ways that you find out about this is there's a website. It's a U.S. Drought Monitor. This is a screenshot I took on the 9th of February of basically where we are now. I have another one that I kept from a year ago where that whole map, there was yellow and reds and other things where you see the reds and the browns and stuff. That's the higher levels of drought, severe drought, and extreme drought. And as you can see, as of February of this year, the West is still having what they consider a drought season, and especially in California, it's extremely severe in that area. But it's something that, as I said, we always have droughts in some part of the United States, it seems like, every decade. And most of them are more than just abnormally dry. And I just got this the other day, an update that I got from Circle of Blue, which is a website that monitors water and water usage, somewhat of an eco-friendly site. But they put an update in from 2015. They calculated the data. Water prices have increased 6% in 30 major cities in the United States in 2015, and that constitutes a 41% overall rise in water costs from 2010. So we're seeing that the price of water is going up. And a lot of that has to do with drought. When you have droughts in places like California, what they do is they'll raise the prices of water to try to dissuade people from using water for watering their lawns and other things, because the cost makes it more prohibitive. But still in all, the water costs are continuing to rise. Water usage. California is the largest producer of agriculture in the United States. And as we saw in an earlier slide, 80% of our water is used in agriculture. And California is the largest. And the biggest part of their, and of course they do raise nuts and fruits and vegetables and other things, but the number one industry that they have is dairy in California, which surprises a lot of people, but that's the truth. And so dairy involves, obviously, dairy cattle. And we're going to talk about dairy cattle in a minute, because the second largest producer of agriculture in the United States is Texas, and their highest percentage product is cattle. They raise cattle for meat. And so those are the two biggest ones. Well, if we look at the next slide, the average cow, and that's the type that are in Texas that they're raising for beef, consumes 20 to 25 gallons of water per day. The average dairy cow consumes 20% more water because of their having to milk. They haven't produced milk. And also because their udders require washing in order to sanitize them before they milk them, their usage goes up 40 to 50 gallons a day per cow. And that's just in the dairy industry out in California. Now we also have in the situation where you think 40 or 50 gallons is a lot of water for usage, but an average family of 4 consumes 400 gallons of water per day. Basically, that's 100 gallons per person per day. That's a lot. That's more than 2 dairy cows per person. And 20% of that water is used for flushing toilets. As I said before, and that water is potable water. That's water we could use for drinking and preparing food, but we're just flushing it down the toilet. That's almost a third of our water that we use on a daily basis in our own homes. The average office worker also uses around 47 gallons per day, and almost all of that is involved with flushing toilets. So we're using water 100 gallons a day at home, and if you work in an office, you're using another 47 gallons a day when you're at work. I would assume that would also apply to possibly schools and things of that nature, because it's outside of the home. Now let's talk about infrastructure. We've got a situation in the United States where the Association of Engineers put out a study or a survey that they did and published in 2009, a report card of the infrastructure of the United States. And all the things that they have on here are issues that are going to affect the infrastructure of cities and things around the United States. And the thing that I want to point out is things like here, drinking water, a D- on drinking water. We also got a D- on inland waterways, D- on levees. We also have a solid waste C+, but our wastewater is a D-. And basically what they're saying here, and that was in 2001, the grade was D+, and 10 years later, it's worsened. And this was done in 2009, and we're almost 2016 now. So it's been 7 years, and I'm sure that it's worse. A lot of the sewage systems, et cetera, and water systems that we have all over the country, especially in areas like the Northeast, are possibly hundreds of years old. In fact, there are some cities in the Northeast that still have wooden sewage lines that were made out of wooden timbers, hundreds of years ago, when we first started building cities. And a lot of them are in failure. The other factor that's come out is there was a report that pointed out that the U.S. annual budget shortfall for replacing drinking water systems is about $11 billion a year. They're falling behind, and that's what they just need to stay even where they are today. And I read an article just recently that said leaky pipes in most cities, because sometimes it takes them a while to get them, a leaky pipe constitutes almost 7 billion gallons of drinking water lost that just goes into the ground in the system. And back to the wastewater aspect, this is a situation that's been high in the news, especially in those of you who are in Michigan. Flint, Michigan's had lead in their water because of things that have happened up there with their sewage and water lines. We've had situations in Colorado where they had that old mine that they all of a sudden someone broke it open and all that yellow stuff came down. It had all the mining chemicals and stuff that they used that polluted the river water in that area of the country. And you see more and more of that. And a lot of cities still to this day put a lot of their wastewater into our rivers and streams to get rid of it. So it's one of the situations we need to keep our eye on as we go forward. So how does that affect cleaning? Well, I think that basically what we need to do as an industry is take a look at all this water and see that with the cost of water going up, with a number of negative things that are happening, we need to be aware that gray water use may become a practical application. As I said, gray water can be used for a variety of things, especially flushing toilets. So maybe if we did that would, or found systems that we could use gray water instead of potable water, that could help keep that water that we use for drinking and preparing food more plentiful. Waterless toilets, we're seeing them now. A lot of waterless toilets, when people think of a composting toilet, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, oh, that's got to smell to high heaven. But if you do a little research, you'll find out that that's not quite the case. Waterless urinals have been big for a long time. I remember being at the Statue of Liberty about 8-10 years ago, and I remember that they had waterless toilets in all of their restrooms, and they were very proud of it. Had a sign up there. So waterless urinals waterless urinals in the Statue of Liberty, but they are coming in, and they're seeing more and more of them, and that's going to make an impact on us. And cleaning chemicals, what we use to clean with, and how that affects the water as it goes through, and what consequences there are. I read a little piece the other day about the fact that there's a study being done on disinfectants and how disinfectants, once they get into the sewage stream, how that affects, what problems do that cause, if any, at the time. It reminds me of a study that was done in Lund, Sweden in 1998. They had a healthcare facility, University Hospital in Lund, Sweden. And they were having, in Sweden, they charge a sewage fee just like they do here in the United States. But in Lund, Sweden, they also measure the amount of affluent coming out of your facility. And if, in the case of the hospital, because they used the disinfectants, their affluent was at a higher level, so they got charged more money for that. Well, that prompted them to do a study that they conducted for about 3 months in 3 different facilities. And what they did is they tested different methods of cleaning to see what kind of results they got, and how, if the floors and the surfaces were clean, and they did some testing. And basically what it came down to is they used disinfectant and cleaned the way they did normally in one of the buildings. In one of the other buildings, they used microfiber and water only. And what they found through doing swab tests and measuring the affluent is they had lower affluent with the microfiber and water, but they also found that there was no difference in the bacteria level on the surfaces using microfiber and water or using disinfectant. And so what they did is they stopped using disinfectant and went to microfiber and water to cleaning a lot of the public area surfaces and things in the hospital, and that reduced the amount of their gray water, or their affluent in their water as they went through. It's also going to have an effect on cleaning equipment. The days of hot water extraction using 6 gallons a minute of water to flush the floor, that's going to go bye-bye. People don't want to use that much water. First of all, it leaves the floor very, very wet. It takes a long time to dry, and now with a lot of buildings like ours going to 24/7, you don't have that dry time. But more importantly, you don't want to be putting that kind of fresh water down on the floor. And basically, with the prices of water the way they are, and also the fact that it's not friendly to the environment. Gray water is something that we need to look at. This is a diagram of a potential house. This would be a residential type of thing, and how gray water systems could be used. And I know that there is a lead building in the Chesapeake area of the country that years ago got a platinum rating, and what they did use a gray water system where they used a cistern on the roof and incorporated water that they got from rainwater. They also had a double plumbing system, so all of their gray water would go through and be filtered and brought back, and they would use that to flush toilets and do some other things with. And that's what this diagram kind of illustrates, is how you can take the gray water, you can take the water from, this is fresh water that you have here that's going into your all the different appliances in your house and fixtures. And what happens is the water from your shower and water from your sink and dishwater or your clothes washer are going down into a tank where they're filtered and processed, and then they're pushed back out, and they come out and they're used then to flush toilets and also go back into use for doing the laundry, but you can also use it to wash your car and water your yard and do all those other things. Whereas the black water from your toilet and also from some other areas, I think this is a dishwasher because there's possible bacteria from old food. That will actually goes to your sewer. And what that does is it saves the amount of fresh water to use that you're using for washing and preparing food in the sink. It's an interesting concept, and I think you're going to see more of that. The waterless toilets, as I told you, basically they're a composting thing, and they got some of them that actually burn it. There's some of them that just actually have a methodology that it will dry out. It separates the urine from the fecal matter, and they've got end up with a lot of different things that they can use. For instance, they can use the fecal matter as it dries out. You can use that for fertilizer in your gardens and things of that nature. The water itself is evaporated off so that the uric acid remains, and etc. It reminds me of the Bill Gates. Bill Gates and his foundation several years ago, I think it was 2013 or maybe even earlier than that, they did a contest where they challenged a number of universities and people all over the world to come up with a toilet that would not require sewage lines, water lines, or any kind of electricity to operate. And they had a winner, and they've since funded those people, and they've actually developed a toilet that you can set anywhere, that it uses solar power and actually processes doesn't use any water, doesn't use any sewage, but the waste that goes in there is processed through and powered by the solar power shield on the top, and it actually converts that waste to something that they can use locally for, burning. A lot of countries still use fires and stuff to cook their food, especially areas like Haiti. Haiti down there, charcoal. They take trees and they make charcoal and they cook outside because that's how they cook. But that's the waterless toilet. Urinals. A lot of waterless urinals right now, and it's becoming more and more standard. The thing that we have to remember as an industry is they take special cleaning, because the urinal basically is right in here. There is a filter, a little filter that's there, and it's oil-based, and what it does is it allows the urine to pass through, and it keeps the sewer gas from coming back up, so you don't have that sewer gas smell in your restrooms. And they have to be cleaned regularly, but the problem is today's bowl cleaners and things actually will break down the oil that's in that filter there, and what that does then, it allows the sewer gas to escape and come back into your restroom. So we have to be very, very aware of that and train our people, make products that can be used to clean these urinals and not impact those seals, those oil-based seals that are down there. They're not real cheap to replace, but more importantly, you don't want that smell in your restrooms. Cleaning with chemicals. It may be that we'll need to use gray water and some kind of a filtration system and be able to use gray water to clean with, as far as floors and some other things, and mix our chemicals. And the chemicals that we use may have to be able to be effective with using gray water. I don't know that there's any studies being done with that right now, but it may be possible. That would be something to look into, because I don't know if current chemicals that are used will work with gray water, if it has to be potable water for that standpoint. Or we're going to go to more dry cleaning products that are easier to use. They don't have to use water. You can clean with them and then vacuum them up, as far as dry carpet cleaning products, things of that nature. And microfiber, as I said before, uses less water, and it cleans just strictly through the technology of the microfiber itself. That may be things that we're looking at in the future with the water systems. As a matter of fact, I've got a white paper that was sent to me this morning after my webinar was advertised, and there's a company that did a white paper. I haven't had time to read it, but it basically was talking about the effects of foam hand soap on water consumed during a typical hand washing. And I assume that the report shows that foam hand washing soap uses less water than the traditional viscous soap. So I'm going to take a look at that, but there's more and more people doing research on those types of things and how we could use less water. I had a gentleman call me the other day who had a product that he says, I can clean floors with this pad and not have to use any water at all. So I haven't seen it, but those are the types of things that may be on the horizon for us as far as innovation is concerned. And speaking of innovation, I'm going to take a little time out here and tell you that I go to Interclean every year. And one of the reasons I go to Interclean, it's not because of the parties, and it's not because of I want to see old friends, and I like to be able to get information from other people that are there and their education policies, or programs. But the biggest thing I do is I work those shows. I go to every booth, and I try to talk to people and find out what they've got and find out if there's new innovation there. The nice thing that they added a few years ago, they added the Innovation Corner, where they have new products that have come out that they think are innovative, etc. And I really encourage anyone to utilize that InfoClean show as a methodology for you to do research without having to travel all over the world or spend a lot of time trying to read about it, etc. It's all right there. And if you really go and talk to people, sometimes they have great ideas, and sometimes it's not the big booth. Sometimes it's a little booth somewhere in the back. But it's a great place and a great resource for me, and has been for a number of years. At this point, I want to stop and see if you have any questions about this process.
Hi, Steve. We do actually have a couple of questions. So the first one that I'm going to ask is kind of an overarching, is this whole issue with, droughts and water shortages and we're going to run out, is it just all media hype, or is it real?
I think it's real. One of the things that comes up is are we going to run out of water? Well, first of all, the country of Israel, a little country, mostly desert, has been desalinating water for years, and they actually provide 90% of all the water that they use in Israel, and there are 8.2 million people. They provide it all through a desalination process, and that's coming right from the oceans. And so if they can do that, I mean, their population is just slightly smaller than the city of New York, and the United States has got sea coasts on the east and west and in the south with the Caribbean. And I think that, we might see some innovation, more practical application of desalinization, where we could get it from there. But then the question is, how do we get it to Middle America? But I just think that with drought and everything, especially for the United States in the middle part of the country, just living in central Illinois like I have for a number of years, there's been at least 4 times in my lifetime here where we've had water restrictions on where we get our water because of drought. And the other thing is the priority during drought is usually agriculture because they need the food. So I don't think we're in danger of going bone dry, so to speak, but I think that there's better ways to use water. And I think the gray water system for things like flushing toilets makes more sense. Why use potable water? Potable water is such a small percentage. And the other factor is that, like I said, our infrastructures are getting old, and the leaks and things that happen, I just think that we won't run out, but I just think it's something we need to be aware of and try to be more conservative as we approach the use of water.
Okay. Another question that came through. Do you recommend that cleaning companies include water conservation to help their clients lower their operational costs? Do you see that being kind of a selling point that could be used to help clients out?
I think that's a great sales tool. A lot of companies aren't going to think about it on their own, but if they point that out in their brochures and things of that nature, we use these products because they use less water and they don't use your potable water, or we use this chemical because we can mix it with just about anything, or if you have a gray water system. I think it's a great way to do it. Do I think it's going to sell a job? Maybe 25% of the time, because I'm not sure a lot of your customers are aware of the fact, except from the fact that their water costs are going up. So I think, and that's basically a lot of people, where ecology hits them worse is where it hits them in the pocketbook. You know, if the gasoline goes up to $4 a gallon, there's a whole lot more people who are driving Priuses than there are big semi-trucks. So, and I think that's what happens is people have to see it in their bottom line as an expense, as a big expense before they really start to take place. But I think it's a great way to do it and also show that you're actually trying to promote good environmental practices.
I know that in the presentation you talked about a lot of different areas, whether it was the waterless toilets and urinals, the chemical usage. What specific area of our industry do you think is most impacted by this water issue?
To be honest with you, I think that the biggest area is going to be anything to do with bathrooms. And I think that because that's where a lot of the water goes, that, and I think carpet cleaning. I think the hot water extraction and the flushing of the carpet, I think is going to be hit pretty hard, to be honest with you, for a number of different reasons, but I think especially because of all the water that is used in that process.
Great, thank you. A couple of more questions that have come through. Should there be a focus on wastewater management for sewage treatment plants as they use a lot of water?
Oh yeah, and I think you'll see that coming because they do use a lot of water, and what they're treating it for is so they can put it down into the streams and put it on down through the normal waterways that go through there. And I think wastewater is going to be real important. And the thing is I read somewhere, and I thought this was an interesting take on it, is a company had talked about how they put in a gray water system, and they said, we use our water twice, which makes sense to me. Why wouldn't we use gray water to flush our toilets, and then, because then we're using it twice. We're using it once to take a shower, and the second time to flush our toilet. In fact, I saw a picture of, not too long ago in one of the periodicals I got. It actually had a sink where the drainage water went over and filled a tank on top of the toilet so that the wastewater from washing your hands would fill your toilet bowl, not outside water source. And then you would use, that would flush your toilet. Every time you wash your hands, you put water in your tank to flush it. I thought that was pretty cool.
There's a couple of questions asking about how you mentioned the desalination process. One just asks, do you have any info on the status of that process? And the other is asking, why are we not doing more of that in other parts of the world?
Well, Israel is probably one of the first, well, they're the ones who initiated it, and I've read several things about theirs. Their water is expensive, of course, and I think that as long as the United States has fresh water at their beck and call through, and by the way, most of that water doesn't come from the streams. It comes from underground aquifers and things of that nature, or for instance, in the case of California, they've got aqueducts in LA that the water comes down from the mountains. But I think that there's no real urgent need to do that. I think a lot of times the threat of disaster is the mother invention, and I think that we see that Israel's got it and they have it, but they're also a small country, so they can have the desalination area and get to the water to their people pretty quickly. But you take comparably numbers as far as population, Israel and the city and New York City, it's about 10 times bigger. So now you've got to have a way to get that water back out to those areas. And I think with our freshwater piping, I'm not sure that that's as in good a shape either. So there's got to be something done with that infrastructure as well as the desalination plant. Great.
I had one more question. You mentioned, this is a follow-up where you mentioned carpet cleaning being hit pretty hard. It asks, what do you think about low moisture extraction systems that utilize foam?
Anything that's going to be low moisture is going to be good, whether it be an encapsulation system that's in a foam or a low moisture liquid or a powder. We've found in our operations we've got pretty much a 24/7 operation, if not 24/7, at least 18 hours a day. So we don't have a lot of time for the carpet to dry. So we've been doing it out of practicality. We've been starting to push that way for a number of years, and also talking to the carpet mills about that type of cleaning. And we find it works really well. The thing that has to happen, though, to be very effective is a lot of people think of carpet cleaning, I'll just take my extractor out or this out and I'll clean the carpets with it. Well, no, you first got to pre-vac. Pre-vacuuming is critical because that takes out all the dry soil out of the carpet. And dry soil, when it hits any kind of moisture, turns to mud. So you want to get as much of the dry soil out first by pre-vacuuming. Then you use your encapsulation process, whether it be a foam or a low moisture or a powder, and that encapsulates the soil. But once it encapsulates and dries, it forms a crystalline product that has to be post-vacuumed out because you actually have to remove that from your soil as well. And what I find with a lot of carpet cleaning processes is they forget the pre-vacuum and the post-vacuum. The process itself may be good, but it's not going to be as effective if you don't pre-vac and post-vac.
Great, thank you. This is actually not a question, but just a kind of a suggestion from one of our attendees on the topic of the desalination plant. They said you might suggest people look at the Carlsbad, California plant. The most modern new plant just opened near San Diego. So now San Diego County will get some restriction relief since they're now creating that new source of water. So that's just a tip for some of you to look into more things going out in California, which obviously has had some of the bigger issues with droughts and everything with this topic. So,
and thank you for bringing that up because I forgot all about that project. I had read about it some time ago, but when I think of desalination, I always go to Israel. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
That's something you can use in your next presentation, Steve.
Absolutely.
Well, that's all the questions that we had submitted today. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I hope you got some great information today. We are going to be sending a link to everyone with a copy of the presentation slides as well as a link to the recorded version of this webinar You can feel free to forward on that link to anyone else, any of your colleagues, clients, anyone that you think might be interested in this topic. And most of all, I'd like to thank Steve. You did a great job, and we greatly appreciate your help with giving this presentation today.
Thank you.